All right, hello there. This is Dr. Karen Richardson. I'm going to be talking to you today about the posterior pituitary hormones. You've probably already had a chance to watch a video or read in the book about the pituitary hormones that are produced in the anterior gland. Well, you've already seen that what we have here is the hypothalamus. We have this area of the brain outlined by a W that, extending from it, we're going to have the pituitary gland. Now, the anterior lobe is much larger, and it is normal epithelial glandular type tissue. It's going to produce and secrete hormones as we would expect. But there's a very big difference in the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is smaller, and it is actually containing neural tissue, extension from the brain. So here, up in the hypothalamus, is where we're going to produce these two hormones, and then we're going to store them down here in the posterior lobe. All right. Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Richardson. I'm going to be talking to you today about the posterior pituitary hormones. If you've already been reading and studying about the pituitary gland, you know that there are several hormones produced by the anterior lobe. The anterior lobe is, of course, much larger. It's glandular tissue that produces and secretes hormones. The posterior lobe is very different. We have the hypothalamus, this W-shaped area of the brain, that is actually the area where we're going to produce these two hormones. The two hormones then will be passed down into the posterior lobe where they're stored. All right, the posterior lobe. Up here in the hypothalamus, we have an area called a nucleus. In particular, this is the paraventricular nucleus. A nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies of neurons that are going to be in a particular area. In this case, they'll produce a hormone. The hormone will then travel down the axons and be stored in the posterior lobe until it's needed and released into the bloodstream. Now, we have two hormones in particular, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Both of these are very different hormones. They're both small peptides, which means they are little small chain of amino acids, only 9 amino acids long. They only differ in 2 amino acids, but the effect that they have is very different, and they target very different type tissues. So it's very important as you learn all of these different hormones that you be able to distinguish between the types. And one of the easiest ways to to separate out the pituitary hormones is to learn these two first, because they're different. They're stored in the posterior lobe, but they're produced in the hypothalamus. So you want to always be able to, out of these 8 main hormones, to just take ADH and oxytocin and learn those first. All right. Now the first one is antidiuretic hormone. Sometimes it can also be called vasopressin. I usually refer to it, though, of course, as ADH, which is the abbreviations. Now, first off, it's important to understand what's a diuretic. Some of you may already know. A diuretic is something that's going to cause increased urine output. So antidiuretic would be something that causes you to retain fluids. So ADH is a hormone that's going to prevent water loss, and that helps in turn keep and maintain a proper blood volume. Now, as you're learning hormones, you're going to be learning all the main things like what is its abbreviation, where is it produced. In this case, ADH is produced in the hypothalamus, but stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary, and its target will be the cells within the kidney. And again, only cells in the kidney are going to respond to this particular hormone. Now, why is it going to be released? What's going to be our signal? Well, if we become dehydrated, if you've been exercising, you're out in the hot, you've lost a lot of fluids through sweating, or you've had a decrease in your blood volume, we're going to have to be able to sense that and react. So there are special type nerve receptors called osmoreceptors present in the hypothalamus that are going to detect this change in the blood. They're going to see if, literally, if the blood is too thick, too sluggish. So if the high concentrations of particles in the blood, the solutes, is too high, then that means that you don't have enough fluids or enough water in the blood. So these particular nerve receptors will pick up on that, and they will cause the release of ADH. And we remember the sensors, these osmoreceptors up here in the hypothalamus, the signal will then go down, those little axons, to where the ADH is being stored, and it will be released directly into the bloodstream. And then, of course, it will only work on the cells that have the receptors in the kidney itself. Now, that type of stimulus, we have 3 main types of stimuli that will control how a hormone is released. And this one would be humoral. Again, humoral means that something in the blood is being monitored. In this case, we're looking at how concentrated the blood is. It's not a specific substance like calcium or glucose, but it's still a humoral type stimulus. Okay. Now, just like anything, what I was talking about is a normal balance situation. But things can go wrong. They can affect the release of ADH. Now, an everyday kind of problem is if we drink too much caffeine or too many alcoholic beverages. Some of you may have experience where someone has drank way too many beers, way too much alcohol intake, and they're going to be in the bathroom. They're going to have several trips to the bathroom with increased urine output. And what's happening is they're losing fluids because ADH is not there to maintain the right fluid balance. Now, in effect, this person is going to wake up with a hangover, and some of the problems are due to this dehydration effect, the fact that they had this block of their normal ADH production. So if you are very thirsty, you actually don't want to pick up a drink that has a lot of caffeine in it, and you definitely don't want to drink a lot of beer. Now, a little bit more rare condition is diabetes insipidus, or water diabetes. It gets that name because its symptoms resemble diabetes, and it can mimic it very well. You have this abnormal increase in urine output. So you have a patient who may have polyuria, and you may remember that if you've already been studying about the pancreas and about diabetes. Polyuria says I've got an increased output of urine, and if that's true, if we're losing fluids, we're going to be thirsty. So you're going to have a patient who's also drinking a lot of fluids. They're thirsty. And those are 2 of the 3 Ps, the critical signs and symptoms of diabetes. So this patient may present as a typical diabetic patient, but they're not. You've got to look into why are they like this. So if you test this patient and you look at the blood levels of insulin and glucose, you'll find that they are normal. The urine does not contain excess glucose. So it's not a diabetic patient that we would expect. So we're going to look into ADH. Something is wrong with the ability of that person to keep fluids in their body. So Is it hypo or hyper? Or do we have too much ADH or not enough? Well, in this case, it is hypo. We have a lack. We have a lack of ADH. Okay, sorry about that. We have a lack of ADH, which means that for some reason, the pituitary gland is not releasing enough ADH for the body. And the reason for that, we could have head trauma. We could have damaged the hypothalamus, damaged the pituitary, and the patient is not producing or releasing enough ADH. Therefore, they lose fluids. The other reason for this could be some type of tumor that is growing within the hypothalamus or the pituitary. And if you've already heard about this, there are two types of tumors. We can either have a proliferative tumor that makes too much of a hormone, or we can have a destructive tumor. In this case, diabetes insipidus would be a destructive tumor because all of a sudden we're not making enough ADH. So there could be two basic causes of this diabetes insipidus, either a destructive tumor or some type of head trauma. Okay. All right, the next hormone that's stored in the posterior pituitary is oxytocin. Again, it's a small peptide, but totally different targets. We're going to be targeting the uterus, and in particular, we are targeting, we're targeting the smooth muscle of the uterus. We're also going to be targeting breast tissue to release and let milk be expressed. Now, if you remember back to hormones in the anterior pituitary, you may have already heard of prolactin. Prolactin has a very different effect. Now, it targets breast tissue, but it does something different. Prolactin causes the development of the mammary glands and the production of milk. But the milk cannot be expressed unless you have oxytocin to work as well. So if we look at oxytocin, here's one of the functions in particular in relationship to parturition. Parturition is childbirth. Okay. Now, childbirth, you've got to think about this woman who's pregnant. As she's progressing, she's getting larger and larger. The uterus is growing. She's also increasing her number of receptors for oxytocin. All right. Let's make sure I can write here. All right. So as it increases, the cells on the smooth muscle in the uterus are going to have an increased number of receptors for oxytocin. And what this means is that we're becoming more sensitive for oxytocin because we know that in the future we've got to have childbirth. What this is called is upregulation. You may have already heard of this term. So upregulation says that I'm going to become more sensitive to a hormone, in particular because I'm getting more and more receptors for this hormone. And they're going to be, of course, in the smooth muscle of the uterine walls. Now, the other thing that's going to be happening as the woman becomes larger and larger, the baby grows, the fetus is stretching the uterus, we're going to have nerve receptors, mechanoreceptors that respond to stretch. And as the pregnancy progresses, they're going to start firing off and telling the hypothalamus here that we're about to have a baby. So as this occurs, as we get closer and closer to full term, we are going to signal for the release of oxytocin. And when that happens, when oxytocin kicks in, we're already more sensitive, right? We already had lots and lots of more receptors on the uterine walls, so we're hopefully ready for this. Oxytocin is released. Now, this is one of the few hormones that's regulated by positive feedback. We want more and more of this hormone. So once it's triggered, once it starts being released, we're going to keep releasing it. And with contractions, the contractions are going to become stronger. They're going to become closer together until the ultimate end of this is the baby will be born. And at that point, we don't need oxytocin for that purpose anymore, and it will all stop. So this is one of those rare situations where we have a positive feedback. Most hormone release is all regulated by negative feedback. So again, when you ever have exceptions, you want to learn this kind of thing. Now, the other main function of oxytocin has to do with milk release. So this is an interesting picture here. We see that we have the milk right here. This is a mammary gland. It's a group of cells that are going to be producing the milk, and then it has a duct here where the milk will be ejected. Now, we already learned that prolactin is telling these cells to produce the milk. Okay? Okay? And it's done its job. As pregnancy nears its close, prolactin starts to be released. We get milk production. Okay? But now we have to have the milk to be released. And there's another hormone for that. Of course, it's oxytocin. So what's going to happen is we're going to get stimulation. The baby's going to nurse. There are nerves in the nipple, mechanoreceptors again, that are going to sense that there's a need for this milk to be released. So that's going to travel. That sensation will go to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will signal for the release of oxytocin. Now, the target is very specific. We have something called a myoepithelial cell. They have muscular fibers in them, very similar to what you find in muscles. These cells have the ability to change shape, to contract. And so they'll have receptors for the oxytocin. Again, remember, hormones are very specific, right? Only cells with receptors for oxytocin will respond. So you have these myoepithelial cells that will start to contract, and they'll push the milk out, therefore letting it down, let down, or expression of milk. So we have to have both of these hormones, prolactin and oxytocin, involved in nursing. Now, this last slide is reminding you again that positive feedback is going to be more and more of a stimulus. And again, we said that prolactin was controlled by positive feedback earlier, and we said that oxytocin is. These are the only two that you want to think about that are positively controlled. And both are very closely related. So if you think about the baby goes to nurse, they're going to stimulate the mechanoreceptors on the nipple, which will send the information back up to the hypothalamus. Now, that's a neural stimulation. Those are nerves involved. So this is a type of neural stimulation for a release of hormone. And it's going to trigger both. Once the baby has started nursing, we want more and more prolactin because we've got to keep milk production going. And we're also, each time the baby starts to nurse, we're going to get oxytocin released to allow the milk to be expressed. Now, this can also be definitely neural. Sometimes just the sound of the baby crying will, the mom will feel the milk let down, or she can think about her baby. So those are definitely neural type stimuli. So as you study these hormones, always be thinking about what causes it to be released. Where is it produced? What is the target? And what does it do? Okay? So these are all the kind of questions that you need to be thinking about as you study this. All right. That's all I had to say, and thank you for your time.